In order to understand Lenin's revolution, we need to go back to the time before it. Karl Marx had said that socialism would come after capitalism, and would most likely start in the more advanced Western countries like England. And after Marx's death, Engels asked a guy called Erdhard Bernstein to produce volume 4 of Das Kapital from Marx's notes. Bernstein also inherited Engels' literature after his death, showing just how important this guy was to the socialist movement. But Bernstein noticed something odd. Things were getting better for the poor under capitalism, not worse as Marx had predicted. Capital wasn't becoming ever more concentrated, and as we now know, income levels had roughly doubled in England and Germany between 1848, when the Communist Manifesto was published, and 1899. Annual meat consumption had increased from £59 per person in 1873 to £105 in 1912. Beer consumption went from 78 litres in 1872 to 123 in 1900, and new consumer items like watches, books, furniture and cigarettes were now being mass-produced in ever larger quantities, and even the poor were beginning to gain access to these goods. In a nutshell, there was no denying that capitalism was improving everybody's lives, contradicting what Marx had predicted. Up to 2 years ago, I tried, by stretching Marx's teachings, to bring them into accord with practical realities. Characteristically, or if you wish understandably, I fully realised the impossibility of such tactics when I gave a lecture at the Fabian Society on the subject, What Marx Really Thought, about a year and a half ago. I still have the manuscript of that talk. It is a frightening example of a well-meaning rescue attempt. I wanted to save Marx. I wanted to show that he had predicted everything that had and had not happened. When I got through with my artistic performance, when I read my lecture over, the thought flashed through my head. You are doing Marx an injustice. What you are spouting about is not Marx. I said to myself, this cannot go on. It is idle to try to reconcile the irreconcilable. What is necessary is to become clear just where Marx is right and where he is wrong. Bernstein therefore turned away from mainstream Marxism, and instead began to advocate for the reform of capitalism rather than revolution to bring it down. Bernstein's book was damaging because it gave revisionism a disciple, Bernstein, and a legitimacy. As the workers' one advances, the path to piecemeal reform grew more attractive to them, and this inference rubbed off on some of the socialists. Thus, there arose within the socialist movement a trend called economism, which attached an intrinsic value to workplace struggles and relegated revolution to the back burner. This evoked Lenin's disdain. Why was Lenin upset? Well, serfdom was only officially abolished in the province of Russia in 1861, and it wasn't until 1881 that the terms of the Edict of Emancipation were made compulsory. Then serfdom continued in other provinces of the Russian Empire, with its last remnants being wiped out in 1892. This was very late in the day, and even then the reforms resulted in problems. Only half of the peasants were given enough land to make a surplus, and redemption dues sapped their income, so that by 1905 most were in debt and unable to invest in agricultural modernisation. Only 20% of the peasants owned their own land. In 1900, an average acre of Russian land produced 8.8 bushels of wheat compared to 13.9 in the United States and 35.4 in Great Britain. And since 85% of the population of Russia were peasants, by the time of the Bolshevik Revolution, Russia's economy remained agrarian at heart and significantly out of date. There were a few cities dotted about here or there, inside which there may have been a few factories, but it wasn't capitalist in any sense of the word. A better way to describe it would be post-feudal. And in fact, Lenin spent much of his early years arguing about whether Russia was or wasn't capitalist, later admitting that it actually wasn't. The increase of the national debt, neglect of consumer goods, and high taxation of peasants can be regarded as serious disadvantages. peasants couldn't improve agriculture and therefore increase productivity. Low bread prices were fixed by the government, but this meant low rates of return for the farmers, and particular hardship when the harvests failed, as they did in 1891, 1892, 1898 and 1901. Poverty, land hunger, arrears in taxation payments and underinvestment continued to plague the agrarian economy. But in the 1800s and 1900s, the intellectuals in Russia were also frustrated by the rule of the Tsars, feeling like they had no voice in the way that Russia was run. There was also an insatiable envy of the West and a desire to have backwards Russia catch up to and overtake the capitalist economies. But rather than embrace free market economics, which would enable the economy to actually work, many were influenced by Marx and decided that they were just going to do socialism instead. Perhaps only in such a poor country, where so many possessed so little, could such sweeping changes be seriously contemplated. The population of richer countries, like those in Western Europe, could feel threatened by such radical claims and thus came to fear the Reds. Lenin's father came from a family of former serfs, but had risen into the middle class and became a noble through his career. He was therefore a monarchist along with Lenin's mother. Lenin's mother was Lutheran but didn't really go to church that often. His father, though, was very religious and made sure that his children were brought up as Orthodox Christians. This shows that Lenin came from a religious background, which is important considering he fell under the religion of socialism. And although the historians don't really say this, by considering the fact that his father died when he was 15, that he favoured his mother, that his older brother had become a rebellious socialist revolutionary, and that there are some other oddities, like the fact that Lenin had a destructive streak as a child, the evidence hints at some kind of antagonism towards his father. Lenin's father was a thoroughly decent man of liberal views who believed in gradual reform and evolutionary change through education. The kind of well-meaning bourgeois that his son would come to despise and scorn more bitterly than he did a die-hard reactionary. Lenin came to hate the very people who his father had been. So let's put a pin in that idea for the moment. Lenin himself was an obedient student in school, and assuming he wouldn't do anything stupid, he was expected to rise up the social ranks to the status of a noble once he completed his state education. He was a loner, and because the state education concentrated on Greek and Latin, he started reading the ancient epics and classics, drowning him in a philosophy which we now know destroys the rational brain: Platonism. This is a philosophy of irrationalism, altruism, and collectivism. Some of those dictators never read or even heard of Plato, but absorbed his kind of ideas indirectly, at home, in church, in the streets, or from the gutter. Some, however, did go back to the source. Russia was ruled by the Tsars, a monarchy stretching back hundreds of years, but by the late 1800s their popularity was on the decline, which is understandable considering how they resisted reform of the social, political and economic system during its transition from feudalism into early capitalism. Nearly 20,000 ministers, provincial governors, senior civil servants and top army officers were assassinated by revolutionary groups in the last 25 years of Tsarist rule. Most moderate opinion did not blame the terrorists, but the government. Seeking radical reform, Lenin's brother attempted to assassinate the Tsar in 1887 and was hanged for his crime. The family was ostracized, and this had a profound effect on Lenin himself, even if he suppressed his emotions at the time. Lenin's parents had worked their way up the social ladder from nobodies to members of the bourgeoisie. By this point they were close to nobles and were part of the establishment. But then, overnight, Lenin's father died, and shortly after, his brother was executed for treason, so the family were then cast to the margins of society and socially excluded. And while Lenin's sisters mourned their loss, Lenin himself seems to have embraced a new idea. They weren't members of society anymore, he thought, so they must stand against it. The Ulyanovs were shunned by bourgeois Simbirsk. This triggered the vitriolic, sometimes uncontrollable loathing for liberals and middle-class do-gooders that he, Lenin, would henceforth show until his dying day. Politics is personal, and this was personal. A young boy who rarely thought about politics became radicalized almost overnight. The phrase remembered by Kashka Damova, "he couldn't act in any other way," is probably our best sign that Vladimir felt impelled to discover why his admired elder brother had acted as he did. Alexander's disappearance had the consequence of hardening the thoughts of a brilliant youth into the posture of a revolutionary activist. I should point out that there is a debate on whether the death of Lenin's brother radicalized Lenin himself. Some say it had no effect at all, while others say it was profound. But let's think about it. He has a brother that is already a revolutionary, suggesting that there was a rebellion against their religious bourgeois and nobleman father. Then his religious bourgeois nobleman father dies suddenly. Then the Tsarist regime kills his brother. And it just so happens that it's at this point that Lenin develops a deep-seated hatred of all religious, bourgeois, and noble people. And you're going to tell me that that's only a coincidence. To top this off, there's plenty of evidence to suggest that Lenin preferred to interact with women than he did men, and I think this is not only an important character trait, but most likely comes from the loss of his father and brother. The men in his life were disappearing from it, and maybe this turned into a distrust of other men. All of the most important relationships in Lenin's life were with women. He had very few close male friends, and nearly without exception he lost those he made, or they fell by the wayside because of politics. Many ruthless and cynical men are sentimental about their mothers. Lenin used to say frequently to family and comrades, "Mother, well, quite simply, she's a saint." A few years after his brother was executed, Lenin also watched one of his sisters die at the age of 19 after a long period of illness, which Lenin felt guilty of because he couldn't save her. So there's definitely a lot of loss in his upbringing, two men who died suddenly and a sister who died slowly as he cared for her. So to me, this is a story about loss and revenge. Lenin lost 3 of his family members, and that loss turned into anger. He would then take his seething rage out on the men whom he believed had wronged him and his family. For Lenin, it's not about constructing something new, it's about tearing down the old and punishing those who had dared to hurt him. And being from the so-called bourgeoisie himself, Lenin not only excelled at school, but then started off studying for a law degree. However, his brother had left behind a lot of socialist material which Lenin now devoured, and within a year he became a revolutionary. One lesson he certainly drew from his brother's death was that it was wrong to be the bomb thrower himself. It would be better to command others to take action while he remained safe and out of harm's way. His protests against the government during his studies resulted in him being expelled. He was in and out of exile and prison during the years 1887 and 1917, and it's during this time that he really started to dive deep on Marxist theory. In a fantastic insight into Lenin's mentality, when a famine erupted in Samara in 1891 and 1892, where 400,000 people starved to death, Lenin condemned the famine relief bodies and refused to help the victims, since, he said, the famine was caused by capitalism. His sister, Anna Ilyinichna, went around the town to help the sick, giving them medicine and advice. Vladimir Ilyich refused to join her. Maria Ilyinichna was confused by all this. She could not reconcile her brother's position with his adherence to an ideology that was meant to serve the poor and the oppressed. Vladimir Ilyich did not have the quality of self-sacrifice, even though he devoted his whole life indivisibly to the cause of the working class. Thus, the famine, according to Ilyanov, played the role of a progressive factor, and he blankly refused to support the efforts to relieve the famine. Peasants were dragging themselves into the towns, pleading for food and for work. Corpses were found lying in the streets, yet Ulyanov, once he had formed his intellectual analysis, would not be deflected by sentiment. But as a socialist, Lenin was right. Aiding the poor would only slow down the development of capitalism and prevent socialism from becoming a reality. So, let's just walk through the logic here. The more we reform capitalism, the less capitalism we have. If we keep introducing policies like minimum wages, high progressive taxation, a national health service, and central banking as called for by Karl Marx in the Communist Manifesto, then we'll placate the poor, who then won't see the need to rise up in revolution. So, in order to get to socialism, we need to implement a true free market capitalism and allow it to progress to its end stages without interference, so that the revolution can occur. Without a free market, we could never get to the end stage of capitalism, and thus never reach socialism. Therefore, anyone who is anti-capitalist or pro-social reform is actually anti-socialist, because they're preventing capitalism from maturing. We'll never get to socialism while we have central banks, rent controls, minimum wages, regulations, monopolies on policing, law and education, or publicly run corporations. This also means that the real socialists are the anarcho-capitalists. So, let us all stand together and free the market so that we can make actual progress. It's also worth explaining that, according to Marx and his prophecies, there were 3, no 5, no 6 stages of history, depending on whether you're reading his early or later stuff, or the theories that were updated after his death. The 5 stages that Marx identified were primitive communism, slavery, feudalism, capitalism, and communism. Now you might ask, where is socialism on this list? Well, during the life of Karl Marx, communism and socialism meant the same thing. But for several reasons, including Bernstein's revisionism, the two began to separate from one another. For some, socialism was added in as an extra in-between step, which is where the later 6 stages came from. It now went from capitalism to socialism and then to communism. Until 1917, communism and socialism were usually used as synonyms. Since the ascendancy of Russian Bolshevism, most people differentiate between communism and socialism, but this differentiation refers only to political tactics. Present-day communists and socialists disagree only in respect to the methods to be applied for the achievement of ends which are common to both. And this is where a lot of people get confused because they don't seem to grasp that these theories evolved over time. So let me clarify this concept. In its original form, socialism and communism were the same thing, and both meant total state control of the means of production, totalitarianism. This is why, if you read the Communist Manifesto, you'll see Marx advocating that the state take over everything. State schools, state central banks, state farms, etc. The proletariat will use its political supremacy to wrest by decree all capital from the bourgeoisie, to centralise all instruments of production in the hands of the state, i.e. of the proletariat organised as the ruling class, and to increase the total productive forces as rapidly as possible. But when challenged on this, they walked it back. It's not totalitarianism, Engels said, because once communism is here, the state wouldn't be needed anymore and would just wither away. When the proletarian revolution occurred, Marx believed there would need to be a brief period called the dictatorship of the proletariat. During this time, class distinctions would be eradicated, if necessary by force, and a classless society would be enforced. Money, private property, ranks, authority would be abolished too. Eventually there would be no need of a state and it would wither away. As Marx preached in the German Society, and Engels explains in Anti-Düring, productivity supposedly comes from labour, and labour is currently enslaved. So once we've reached communism, labour becomes free. Men wouldn't be tied to a particular job. There would be no specialists because they would be freed from the means of production. So, as Marx and Engels write, as long, therefore, as activity is not voluntary, but naturally divided, man's own deed becomes an alien power opposed to him, which enslaves him instead of being controlled by him. For as soon as the division of labour comes into being, each man has a particular exclusive sphere of activity, which is forced upon him and from which he cannot escape. Can anyone tell that Karl Marx never had a job? Because I certainly can tell that Karl Marx never had a job. You are not forced or enslaved by your job. You're not. You volunteer to do it. Yes, you do. He is a hunter, a fisherman, a shepherd, or a critical critic, and must remain so if he does not want to lose his means of livelihood. Yes, because nobody is able to change their job. Whereas in communist society, where nobody has one exclusive sphere of activity, but each can become accomplished in any branch he wishes, society regulates the general production, and thus makes it possible for me to do one thing today and another tomorrow. To hunt in the morning, fish in the afternoon, rear cattle in the evening, criticise after dinner, bum off my friend Engels for the whole of his life because I can't be bothered getting a job, just as I have in mind, without ever becoming hunter, fisherman, shepherd. Mummy, can I have some din-dins, please? I really can't stand Karl Marx anymore. I don't know how I was ever a socialist. So, imagine a state school, but there's no state. Nobody owns it. But the teachers, who aren't teachers, they're just random people, randomly turn up on a given day to teach the kids for free, who also randomly turn up. Society as a whole regulates the school, whatever that means, and everything just sort of operates by some magic invisible hand. Random people just turn up to a nuclear power plant to produce nuclear power. Other nobodies get into the pilot seats of passenger planes, start open heart surgeries, or help build bridges even though they're not qualified, because having a qualification would require dedicated and specialist study, and that would result in a division of labour. More just randomly wander onto farms to produce food for the sake of it, and people who aren't delivery drivers by profession drive the food around for free, and that's how it randomly appears at the school. I mean, nobody knows how much food is needed at the school, or any other building for that matter, because we can't predict how many people are going to be there since there's no free market price mechanism in order to make the necessary economic calculations, but somehow it all just works. So, how do we get to this magic wonderland? Well, Marx said that the workers would rise up in a rebellion against the bourgeoisie, and in his early works, he said that the state would take over and rationally arrange everything. But, of course, he walked back on that idea later on, so the new idea was that somehow everything would just fall into place. Fantastic. And despite a lot of words written in criticism of capitalism and other socialists, Marx and Engels failed to accurately describe how we would form this mythical communist society, nor how it would actually function without a state. So the followers of Marx then began to debate this to try and figure it out, and this is where the splits occurred in the socialist and communist movements. Some socialists claim that socialism was democratic in nature, others claim it was anarchic, as there would be no state at all, while still others said that it was a statist dictatorship, and the origins of this divide stretch all the way back to the beginning, technically even pre-Marx. Even to this day, one socialist will tell you that it's anarchy, while another will tell you it's totalitarianism. So the main question is a state necessary to get to this nonsense utopia? Well, the answer from the Marxist-Leninist point of view was yes, but also no. Socialism ended up becoming separate to communism, and socialism would be an intermediary stage you would go through in order to get to communism. Socialism would be the dictatorship of the proletariat, to quote Lenin, state control the means of production. Then the state would wither away, to quote Engels, and you would get communism. And then Lenin seems to have changed his mind later on to say that the dictatorship is only needed during the revolution, but whatever. The point is that the totalitarian dictatorship was the first step on the road to communist serfdom. Then, to muddy the waters still further, Lenin said that his regime was democratic. But what he knew, and what I've been explaining in previous videos, is that democracy is dictatorship. Lenin himself said this, as did Mussolini and Hitler and numerous others. Democracy is you voting away your individual freedom to the collective, the government. Democracy is a form of statism. That's why Lenin said he was fighting for the revolutionary democratic dictatorship of the proletariat and peasantry. Let me just repeat that bit. Democratic dictatorship. So, for Marxist-Leninism, the variant of socialism and communism that dominated the 20th century, socialism is totalitarian state control of the economy. But as I said, the socialist world was divided, and still is. Some were advocating for social democracy, and in response to Eduard Bernstein, Lenin criticised anyone who promoted the idea of political reform over revolution. When he first read Bernstein's words, Lenin lost his appetite and developed insomnia, because for Lenin, socialism was all about power, and Bernstein was a direct threat to what Lenin thought Marxism was at its core, the revolution. It's not about helping the poor, it's about getting the totalitarian state set up so that it can later wither away and bring in paradise, for Lenin. Which is why he said reforms were only a side effect of the revolutionary class struggle, not its goal. This understanding of Marxism separated Lenin not only from Bernstein, but also from many other followers of Marx who found the materialist interpretation of history, or the centrality of class struggle, or the destiny of the proletariat to be more important aspects of his teachings. "Not a single Marxist has understood Marx," Lenin said, and I agree. Lenin apparently never asked himself why, before 1921, the Bolsheviks were incapable of giving the people anything but chaos, civil war, hunger, and terror. The fact is, the Bolsheviks had achieved their goal. The party had power. The revolution was for Lenin a social experiment. Not quite. Inside the mind of every socialist or communist is a deep-seated hatred of capitalism. To them, that is the priority. It's not about the establishment of a new system, it's about bringing down the current system, which is why their writings concentrate on disparaging capitalism rather than working out the details of socialism. This hatred of capitalism comes from an inner conflict that they're suffering from, which is a clash between their altruist morality and objective reality. Altruism does not work in reality, but they so wish it would. And thus, they take their anger out on the capitalist system and blame it, reality, for not allowing them to remain a child at heart into adulthood. They do not want to grow up. They want to remain Peter Pans and are upset that the world is not Neverland. Their fear of independence, their fear of taking responsibility for their own lives is challenged by the reality of having to get a job, work hard, and look after oneself. They don't want to do any of that. They want someone else to look after them, namely the collective or the state. And so capitalism, or more accurately reality, becomes the target of their hatred. If they wish something which is contrary to the facts, society, meaning other people, will somehow provide it. If they act irrationally, other people will save them from the consequences of their irrationality. If they demand the irrational or the unearned, other people will provide it. They hope that by enslaving the producers of the goods in life, the economic producers, by creating an omnipotent state which will rule everybody's life, they, the irrationalist, will somehow ride on the shoulders of the rational members of society, the productive members, those able to deal with the facts of reality properly, not only in the issue of producing material goods, material wealth, but in all issues. If these providers are enslaved by the state, then their energy and their productiveness will permit the irrationalist to gain the unearned in matter in the form of unearned wealth, and the unearned in spirit in a form of unearned honours or government positions. So, just like all socialists and communists, Lenin and the Bolsheviks were incapable of giving people anything but chaos, civil war, hunger and terror because they have this deep-seated hatred of reality. It's not about helping others, it's about gaining power so that they can destroy reality and take their anger out on the world, and then sit back and reap the unearned rewards ripped from the hands of their new slaves. This is why Lenin's childhood is so important. The loss of his father, brother and sister, plus the religious upbringing which gave him a belief in altruism, resulted in guilt and shame. From this hatred of himself and the world, Lenin then had a fear of being independent, of getting a job and making a career and life of himself. That's why Lenin only worked 2 years of his entire life. The rest he spent scrounging off others until he took over Russia. At the time of the revolution in 1917, Lenin, aged 47, had spent all of 2 years in paid work. His inability to become independent or take responsibility resulted in a desire to be taken care of. This is why he was close to his mother and sisters, and why he desired power via revolution. It was a means to not only destroy the reality that he didn't like and get revenge on the oppressors who had wronged him, but also enable him to be taken care of and avoid real work. And the scariest thing about this is that if you look at all the other revolutionaries, a similar story plays out. But that's a story for another day. The point is that socialism is not about helping others, it's a desire to be taken care of coming from a fear of independence rooted in a hatred of the self. And once you see it from this perspective, it all lines up. Since it's all about power, the promises socialists make are completely meaningless. They promise you the world, but then deliver you into slavery. Lenin had a slogan which said, "Peace, land and bread." But as we'll see in a future video on the revolution itself, he didn't care about the people at all. He didn't give them land, peace or bread, or democracy, and he waged wars against the peasantry while crushing the proletariat under his boot. All these slogans and theories are just tricks to deceive people and form a totalitarian state for the benefit of the new elite, and that's precisely what happened in Russia. In 1895, Lenin was able to travel abroad and meet his socialist heroes, and having associated with such criminal and terrorist elements, he was arrested on his return to Russia, interrogated, and exiled to Siberia. This was also the first time his mental health started to trouble him. He was afflicted by the nerves that were to bother him until he died. Like his sisters Anna and Maria, as well as his parents, he was highly strung. Bouts of emotional instability frequently occurred when he was stepping into the unknown. Again, this to me suggests a fear of independence. And as explained earlier, because Russia was mainly agrarian and because 85% of the population were peasants, Russia had a post-feudal economy. It was not capitalist in any sense of the term, and obviously, in order to get to socialism, you need capitalism first. The proletariat need to become class conscious, and then rise up against the bourgeoisie in violent revolution. But if 85% of the population are peasants, that's clearly not going to happen. So the logical conclusion was that there wasn't going to be a revolution in Russia. But what Lenin did was attempt to prove that Russia was, in fact, capitalist. And how did he do this? Well, since 85% of the population were peasants, the obvious thing to do would be to claim that most of these peasants were proletariat, and that some of them were capitalists. I know that seems like a stretch, and indeed it was, but there was no other choice. Since his priority was power and revolution, Lenin had to bend Marxism to fit the economic realities of Russia. So, in exile, he wrote books on the development of capitalism in Russia. In fact, that was the name of one of the works that he published. He said that the peasants were now the proletarians, and that a small minority of peasants had become rich capitalists. These he called the kulaks, the tight-fisted persons, because they held their villages in their grip. Lenin said that there were 3 types of peasants, the top, middle and bottom, with the kulaks at the top. And he split them like this to show that rural Russia had embraced capitalism, when in fact it hadn't. Again, if Russia was capitalist, then Lenin and the Russians could aim for socialist revolution. If it wasn't capitalist, then that would mean they would have to wait for capitalism to mature, which means getting a job. Lenin was still in Siberian exile when the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party, RSDLP, was founded in March 1898. Only 9 activists were present at the founding, showing how fringe this group was at the time. This is why he wrote his highly influential and controversial 1902 book, What Is to Be Done? Not only was this the first time he called himself by the Lenin pseudonym, but it shows the totalitarian nature of his thinking. Lenin brought up the organisation question that had been abandoned years earlier, insisting that what was needed in the party was discipline and unity, not democracy and criticism. There could not be criticism of the leader himself because Lenin wouldn't tolerate it, but perhaps more importantly, Lenin insisted that the revolution would be conducted by a small group of professional revolutionaries led by the real political leaders of the entire people. This was probably because he knew Marxism wasn't popular, since there weren't that many proletariat in Russia, and so it had to be done by a small group, not a majority. Lenin insisted that his Marxism was orthodox Marxism. But despite what Soviet historians said later, there is no such thing as orthodox Marxism. Like Hegel, Marx was entirely inconsistent, self-contradictory, and vague, which is why few have actually read him, and those few that have argued amongst themselves about what he actually meant. So Lenin's claim at orthodoxy also sparked controversy at the time. To avoid the authorities, Lenin moved to London in 1902, where he complained about the apartment he was staying at. It just wasn't up to his upper-class standards. He was affronted by the menage at Sidmouth Street, which he disparaged as a commune. This was a revealing use of language. Lenin, the Marxist, a believer in the desirability and inevitability of a communist society, was repelled by the idea of a collectivist style of life. Commune was a dirty word for him. He preferred the lexicon of order, neatness, and obedience. Yes, because communism isn't for the elite like Lenin. It's for you. Lenin wants communism to enslave everybody else while he becomes the slave master. You're going to be in the commune, but he won't be. And I hope you're beginning to see that now. Neither in Russia nor abroad did Lenin suffer deprivation. He lived on his mother's resources, his party salary, the donations of various benefactors at various times. Pamphlets and articles printed for illegal distribution inside Russia earned precious little, while the émigré market for such works was scarcely more rewarding. Lenin truly was a mommy's boy, and she sent him money, clothes, food, books, and more. His mother sold their estate and bought a farm which they leased to a kulak. They then sold the farm and lived off the interest, and right up until 1908 at the earliest, when he was 38, Lenin was constantly asking his mommy for money. Only from that moment onwards was the party able to give him a salary. He loved holidays in expensive resorts, and he often went to the theatre and cinema. All this was perfectly natural behaviour, especially for the hereditary nobleman Lenin described himself as, and there was no need for him to make a big secret of it. What remains a mystery, however, is not the financial details of his everyday life, but how he, like his comrades Trotsky and Stalin, none of them ever having worked for a living, and none of them having anything in common with the working class, could think that they had the right to determine the fate of a great nation and to carry out their bloody monstrous experiment. Well, now we know. It was all for their own benefit due to their fear of independence. But we'll check out their backgrounds another time. Hating London, hating the food, and hating the English as well as the English socialists, Lenin soon moved again, this time to Switzerland. During the Congress there in 1903, yet another split occurred. Lenin divided the Russian Social Democrat Labour Party into two groups. Those that sided with him and wanted a small party of professional revolutionaries were now called the Bolsheviks, meaning majoritarians. And those that wanted a larger, broader party were called Mensheviks, minoritarians. And the names were wrong. The Bolsheviks weren't the majority. They had fewer supporters than the Mensheviks, but the names stuck. What this shows is that socialism and communism are divided in many ways on tactical and ideological grounds. Nobody knows what these things are, and nobody knows how to get to them. It's all just a big mess. But in this instance, the split would have fatal consequences. The majority of the socialist movement were now deemed to be the minority, and these were advocating for social democracy, social reform, and later trade unionism. They wanted the workers involved and a large political party in their name. Lenin and his minority, who were now deemed to be the majority, even though they weren't, didn't care about the workers. Lenin and his faction just wanted power for their own sake. And these two groups were now entwined in the same party, the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party. This is incredibly similar to what happened in the German Social Democratic Party, the SDP, which I've talked about in the second video of my Weimar hyperinflation series. I will continue that series at some point, but if you've seen that second video, you'll realise that the socialists in both Germany and Russia were in the same boat. Well, so were the socialists in England and in Italy. In fact, the split continues to this day, which is why there is such vicious infighting amongst the various socialist groups. Socialism means different things depending on which faction you belong to, and that's why it's so hard to define it without someone crying about the definition. Realistically, socialism needs to split apart into numerous different factions, and from the early 1900s, that's exactly what happened. However, the split didn't occur openly just yet. The one party remained, but contained multiple different factions inside it. They all continued to pretend that they were a united front, but it was all a lie.
The party in reality has been torn apart. The rulebook has been turned into paper rubbish. The organisation has been spat upon. Only naive bumpkins can yet fail to see this. The theory of Marxism, as expounded by Marx and Engels, was that a single class, the proletariat, would undertake the task of introducing communism. It stupefied Russian Marxists that the Marxist movement should split into two separate organisations.
It was only after 1914 that the split became visible to the public, especially after 1917. And since then, it's fractured even more, leading to all the different variants of socialism and communism viciously fighting and murdering each other. Socialists really do seem to hate themselves as much as they hate capitalism, because that's the origin of the problem, self-hatred. Now, it's at this time, 1902 to 1903, that Lenin's health was really beginning to get worse. After suffering from stomach issues, tiredness and insomnia, he went to a doctor who told him that they were all symptoms of the bigger problem, which was his brain. However, it may not have been his brain, it may have been his diet, but I'm not a doctor, so I'll leave that to the experts. Regardless of exactly what the cause was, one of the treatments was the same. He needed to cut down on his workload, and I can certainly relate to that. Lenin was reading and writing a lot, he was arguing, giving speeches, and just getting passionately, emotionally worked up all the time. His lifestyle was giving him stress and anxiety, but he couldn't cut down because he passionately believed that he was a man of destiny. Ultimately, his devotion to the cause would drive him into an early grave.
When he talked about the Mensheviks, Lenin could hardly control himself. These tirades of his, which were delivered with such passion, must undoubtedly have worn him out and used up a great deal of his reserves of energy. His frenzied state of rage and extreme nervous tension would be followed by exhaustion, decline of energy, listlessness, and depression. Many biographers and people who met Lenin attest to the enormous physical force of his mind. Perhaps this was because he usually crushed his opponents in arguments with his absolute refusal to compromise. But many people began to stress the force of Lenin's mind and to relate it to the shape of his head. The structure of his skull is truly striking. One has to study him for a little while to appreciate its physical power, the contours of the colossal dome of his forehead, and to sense something I can only describe as a physical emanation of light from its surface. And in case there was any doubt, no one is able to confirm whether light really did emanate from Lenin's forehead.
And yes, a real historian did write that. There was a revolution in Russia in 1905 when peaceful protesters were shot by government troops on the 9th of January. Mass protests and strikes followed. One of the Mensheviks, Pavel Axelrod, who, unlike Lenin, was actually raised in poverty, disagreed with Lenin's idea of a small professional revolutionary party. Preferring that the workers have a voice of their own, he came up with the idea of a council of worker representatives from the factories. These councils were called Soviets, which is the Russian word for council. So note, it was the Mensheviks who came up with the idea of the Soviets, not Lenin or the Bolsheviks. And indeed, the Bolsheviks actually despised the Soviets at this stage. These facts are going to be important to remember when we come back to talk about the revolution in a future video. At this time though, Lenin was still in Switzerland and was taken by surprise by this revolution. Nonetheless, he started calling for armed insurrection and mass terror, his words not mine. He also criticised liberal democracy and demanded a dictatorship. Ultimately, the 1905 revolution was largely unsuccessful, as most of the reforms that were implemented were walked back by the Tsarist government. Nonetheless, Lenin drew lessons from it, as well as previous revolutions in history like the Paris Commune in 1871. What needs to be pointed out though is that most revolutions up to this point had been sparked by war and general instability. The Russian Revolution of 1905 was the byproduct of the Russo-Japanese War, and the Paris Commune, which Marx and Engels had said was the first dictatorship of the proletariat, was birthed in the aftermath of the Franco-Prussian War. So what really needed to happen was another war, plus more general instability. Well, that war and instability came in 1914. Lenin was distracted by women in 1914 and wasn't at his political best. He just didn't understand the world outside of Marxist politics, and when the First World War kicked off, he had mixed feelings about it. On the one hand, he thought war could result in the revolution, but on the other hand, he saw that rather than stand in solidarity with their international comrades, the workers around the world had rallied to their nation's flags.
When Lenin heard on 5th of August 1914 that the German Social Democrats in the Reichstag had voted for the war budget, he declared, "They have betrayed socialism. From this moment I cannot call myself a social democrat. I am a communist."
The First World War showed that the workers weren't interested in internationalism. Worse, they were willing to fight for capitalism. This reinforced Lenin's view that a democratic approach to socialism wouldn't work, as the workers wanted socialism in one country, nationalism, not internationalism. The irony was that Italy was the exception to the rule. Where all the other socialist parties in Europe were in favour of war, Italy's Socialist Party was against it, seeing it as a bourgeois war between nations. Well, one socialist, called Mussolini, who was initially pro-neutrality, changed his mind. He now thought that war would lead to revolution, which is the exact same conclusion Lenin came to. So, Mussolini abandoned his neutrality just like socialists in every other nation did, but was subsequently kicked from the Socialist Party in Italy. Had he been in any other country, Mussolini would have remained in the mainstream Socialist Party. Having kicked him out, the Italian Socialist Party now thought Mussolini was politically doomed. But they got it backwards. Their impotency resulted in them losing support, and that strengthened Mussolini.
In 1914, Italian Socialist Party membership stood at 58,326. In 1915, it was 41,974, and by 1917, 27,918. If it had supported the Italian war effort, as its comrades did elsewhere in Europe, the party would probably have swept to power after the war with Mussolini as its leader. Instead, Mussolini's brand of socialism, fascism, would sweep it aside.
Note how the pro-war stance was needed in order to get the socialist parties into power in their respective nations. Italy was the exception, and its socialist party dwindled, to be replaced by the pro-war fascists, who were socialists in all but name. It also shows us, once again, that socialism is not a united movement by any stretch of the imagination.
Mussolini was the only one among you with the mind and temperament to make a revolution. Why did you allow him to leave? However, against Lenin's expectations, the war dragged on interminably, and by early 1917 he had all but given up on seeing revolution in his lifetime. Thus, he was taken completely unawares when the Russian monarchy suddenly collapsed, so little did he understand his native land and the government crisis.
Soviet propaganda later tried to make the claim that Lenin was a popular figure outside of Marxist circles. The proletariat, they claim, had reached a stage of class consciousness that enabled the revolution to take place. In reality, the Bolsheviks were a fringe faction, and they had little support amongst the population, since the proletariat and the peasantry favoured the social revolutionaries or the Mensheviks. But Lenin had created a small professional revolutionary force, and by 1917 he was poised to use it, so we'll see him do so in a future video on the Russian Revolution itself, and be sure to subscribe to the channel to be notified of that. But in summary, Lenin's childhood resulted in a self-hatred that manifested itself as a desire for totalitarian control, so as to be looked after by others and avoid having to get a job and live an independent life. Due to the fact that most of Russia was a backwards agrarian post-feudal economy, Lenin had to adapt Marxism to fit the unique situation in his country, at which point he founded what was known as Marxist-Leninism. Pretending that Russia was capitalist, he rallied a small but professional revolutionary force behind him and waited for the right moment to strike. That moment came in 1917. If I have released that future video on the Russian Revolution, I'll link to it on the screen. If not, check out the other history videos on my channel. Thanks for watching, bye for now.